My conversation today is with author, translator, astrologer, and practitioner Normandi Ellis. Normandi has earned a place of prominence in the study, interpretation, and practical applications of ancient Egyptian magic and mythologies, as well as in Judeo-Christian angelology. Normandi is also a skilled clairvoyant and spiritualist. Her work on the sacred nature and metaphysical power of language, entitled Imagining the World into Existence, was pivotal in my own journey towards transformation and recreation. I sat down with Normandi today to talk about her early work in translating Egyptian texts, Egyptian magic, the power and limitations of words, angelology and the nature of spiritual entities, the importance of remaining mindful in practice, and much more. Normandi's ease in weaving the threads of her vast knowledge and practical experience and inspired insight made for a fascinating and fulfilling conversation. I'm Ike Baker, and this is the Arcanum Podcast. Normandi Ellis, thank you so much for being with me today. I want to tell you something. You know, you and I have been corresponding for a little while, but I wanted to save this for when we were recording. So I do a lot of reading, and that informs a lot of, I guess my practice and my spirituality and the things that I talk about on my channel. But before I got really into any kind of actual practical Western ceremonial esotericism, before I read Skinner, before I read Rankin, before I read Leach, I was reading your stuff, and it actually, the book, Imagining the World into Existence, I was going through a really hard time, one of those aporia moments where you're struggling with everything, you're just kind of wandering. And I was drawn to that book. I believe I purchased it on Amazon, and it changed the course of my life. Really, I read about Egyptian healing and medicine, and I went to school for traditional medicines because I just felt this is a message. This is something. This is powerful. So I mean, to have this conversation with you today it's been like a decade in the making, and I'm so appreciative that you're here.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm so glad you said that. That makes me feel like all this sitting at a desk with an ink pen and staring out the window has been worth it.
Well, yeah, I know how you feel, but absolutely worth it. Absolutely worth it. And your name is still among, people that are very relevant today, and a lot of practitioners and people that are interested in this stuff, particularly Egyptology, and angel work, that, they're familiar with your stuff. So I'm interested, what started you on your path towards this? I mean, not merely just historically, but how'd you get into magic and all this stuff?
Yeah, I fell across the work of Dion Fortune. And so that was always the start. That's always been the start for me. I started reading it very early on, um, and continued to read things around that particular topic. Studied the Kabbalah, studied, all kinds of things. But as I was reading Dion Fortune initially, I ran into a friend who was a Rosicrucian, and so we started talking about comparative uh, mystery traditions. And I told him of my interest in Dion Fortune and in some of the stuff she had said about being an Egyptian priestess. And so he said, "Well, you should go and get the Wallace Budge book." So I did. And he left town and had to move out of his apartment and left me a huge box of all of his Rosicrucian teachings. He said, "Don't, you're not supposed to pass them around, but you can read them because I'm." And then he didn't come back for them. He died. So I kind of felt like, I put them in the closet. The closet was vibrating, going, "Ooh, ooh, ooh." Like, I need to do something with these. So when I had the opportunity um, I had moved and taken them with me to Colorado, and I had an opportunity to work in a translation workshop that I was taking while I was getting my master's, and studied Spanish translations. And then I didn't have a second language, which was part of the requirement. The professor, Sidney Goldfarb, uh, said to me, "Why don't you pick something that you like?" And I said, "Hieroglyphs." He said, "Well, go and get a good grammar dictionary and a bunch of variant translations and a text you want to translate and go for it." So that's what I did for 10 years. I just kept translating the Book of the Dead over and over again. I fell in love with the script. I fell in love with the hieroglyphs, and all the power that was inherent inside the language. And it was like once I started translating it with not just word for word, but for each line, I would end up with a paragraph. I would have imagery and uh, wordplay, and which I'm fond of doing, and just sort of the story, which was never put in one spot in the ancient Egyptian tradition. So I found myself doing a lot of work and loving it and getting up at 4 in the morning and translating these texts. And, it would take me hours. I had all these reference books piled up all around me, really high. I'd fall asleep on top of them, and someone would come in and the door would snap and it'd wake me up, and I'd say, "Oh, I know what it means now." It was like it was all rolling around in there. And I did that for 10 years until somebody wrote to me and said, that text you were working on in graduate school, you wouldn't happen to have finished it, would you?" So I said, "Yes, I did. Would you like to see it?" Send it off to him. I had gone through the text 3 times over and over. I would have kept writing it if he hadn't asked for it. And in fact, I was really pleased when Red Wheel Weiser decided to reissue the book. It had been out almost 30 years, 30, maybe 35, I'm not sure. But they said, "We need an updated version. And would you like to add anything?" I said, "Oh, yeah, I'd like to add how I've used it over these past 30 years." And so I didn't change the contents of it, but I changed the use of it in a way.
Mhm.
And so there's a new edition out there, and I'm very excited about it.
Excellent. So when was your first proper pilgrimage?
Well, after I had finished translating the book and published it, I took what pittance of royalties I had, and I went to Egypt on my first trip by myself. I was supposed to go with a friend of mine, Virginia Webb, and she became otherwise busy. She was in a hospital in a coma,
Oh, wow.
and so I ended up going to Egypt by myself. I didn't know the language, the Arabic. I didn't know Arabic. She knew Arabic. I didn't know Arabic. So I'm in Egypt all by myself trying to figure out how to go different places that I had always read about, places I wanted to see. So I went through that first trip alone, and I won't say entirely alone because I had a lot of help from spirit along the way.
Mm.
You know, people who would show up in places, tell me, what I needed to know at the time I needed to know it. Um, so my first trip was with Jean Houston in 1990. I think it was 91, 90 or 91. And she had 98 people going. Jean Houston had been the person that when it was time for my book to do an audio book, this was back when people had cassettes, audio cassettes. So Jean Houston had recorded it in Chicago. And then she came to meet me at a conference. And I just remember, I just remember her coming up to me and like grabbing me by the shoulders and then just folding me into her. And she said, "Lady, I have just finished reading your book and you have no idea who you are yet, but you will." And I was like, "Oh, well, thank you." I felt like she had lifted up a rock and just like called down and told me to come up. It was amazing.
Wow.
So when she invited me to go on this trip with her, I was like, absolutely, I'll do it, you know. And at the time I was getting a divorce. I was moving back to Kentucky with my daughter. It was all very sudden and very, I don't know, just spirit jumping in and saying, "You want a new life? This is your new life." And so I went with Jean, and I worked with Jean some years after that. And I helped her with some of the research and some of the editorial polishing and thought processes in her book, The Passion of Isis and Osiris. I don't know if you ever read that, but I compiled the retelling of the myth of Isis and Osiris in her book. That was the first time I had put it all together. So that was my first trip to Egypt with 90 people in Gene Houston. And we would get, we would get out of the bus somewhere. Like we got out at Tel El Amarna. Have you ever been there? Tel El
Oh, no,
Amarna.
I haven't been there yet.
Yeah, well, there's nothing there. I just want to warn you, except for some little low walls that kind of outline where the temple was and a few things,
And Amarna was the new capital under Akhenaten, right?
under Akhenaten, exactly.
Mm.
And it's this huge open sky. And so we get off the bus and the people are looking around like, what are we supposed to be seeing? There's one column, by the way, just one column. And so Jean walks over to me and she says, what are we going to tell them about this place? And I said, Akhenaten came here because this is where the sun brought him and it was the opening of the heart. And we're going to learn how to reach out with our hands the way that Aten did and embrace each other.
Mm.
And she goes, okay, that's what we're doing. It was really funny.
That's excellent. Yeah, I consider trips to Egypt a pilgrimage for all spiritual people. Definitely I would say people in the West, but really I consider, and as I'm sure you do, the Egypt to be, the history of the world. It's for everyone. But on that note, you still go, right? And you're conducting some group trips there.
Oh, yeah, I still go. I have a company called Two Ladies Travel Co.com. So, and it's TWO, Two Ladies Travel Co.com, which we run trips with a friend, Osset Roan, and I. She's a wonderful harpist. She's a beautiful Egyptologist. And so we like to get on the boats and teach on the boats and then go to the different places. And yeah, and oftentimes I'll lead trips where one of my favorite things to do, which is probably one of the things we're going to do in December 2025, is to use our journals. That's called the Doors of Egypt trip. And so we're going to every place we go, we're going to consciously walk through a door, a metaphorical, a psychic door as we walk through the place, and then record, the visions and the information that comes. I take a trip about twice a year. I try to go early in the year, like 2025, and there's still a few little spots left in the February 2025 trip. And then I'll go in November or December. It's gotten to where the months that are perfect for traveling, as the world's gotten hotter, the months have been pushed back more into the tail end of or the beginning of winter, because that's really the best time to travel there.
Yeah, I was told when we went that during the summer people like they sleep all day. They can't go outside. So
Right.
really interesting. Uh So big groups, small groups, and where do you get where do you personally like to go? Where do you make sure you go every time you go to Egypt?
Okay. We usually go on a dahabeah, so there's no more than about 24 people in a trip. Sometimes as few as 10.
Well,
I like the interpersonal connection that comes with having a small trip because I travel so often. I get confused with who people are. And so it's really a lot easier for me to keep somebody's name in my head if I have a smaller trip and to keep their whole story and to hold them a lot closer if the trip is small. I like to have interaction with folks. My
mhm.
favorite places to go, of course, Philae. I love Philae, the Temple of Isis. I like it. Uh, I love to go there early in the morning. We usually get special riders so that we can come in the dark, take a boat in the dark across the lake and go in. And then we will process. Usually I will go with the group and we'll process all the way to the back of the Holy of Holies at the Temple of Isis. We'll have um, I'll have to say a ceremony. You can't do oils or any of that stuff, but you can hold your heart open, and you can stand in front of the altar and you can feel the energy coming down to you. That is where um, I have consecrated priestesses of Isis inside that room.
Wow.
And I love going to sit out on the wall at the Trajan kiosk there at that temple and watch the sun come up, just kind of sing it up. We're the only people there, and it's beautiful. And sometimes the guys who sell the jewelry and the coffees, and all of that, they'll light incense on their side and they'll waft over to where we can smell this beautiful frankincense and kefi incense is burning. It's quite nice. We're not allowed to do it, but they can do it. So
Right. Right. That's nice. They're doing it for you.
that's right. That's right.
That's
So
great.
that's private trips. We usually do two. That's one of the ones that I love to do. And the other one that I love to do is to again at sunrise, because I feel sunrise is the place that Egypt was made for. It's all about the light and moving the light inside your body. So we will stand between the paws of the Sphinx and wait for the sun to come up
Wow.
and feel that penetrating light that, ignites the papyri in our heart on which all of our prayers are written. You know, it's quite nice.
Yeah, that's beautiful. That's beautiful. And I think that there's definitely something, to that for anybody that might be skeptical is I remember we went to Dendera and it blew me away really.
And
And
there is, yeah, it is.
unbelievable. We didn't even plan to go. We just kind of had these last minute reconfigurations of our travel, and it just so happened we ended up there. We didn't even realize it till maybe a day later. We ended up there on Mother's Day, which was last year, which is really funny. But
Perfect day to be there.
yeah, yeah.
The oldest goddess of all of Egypt at Mother's Day.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and she was with us most of the trip, to be honest with you. I mean, so some of the first effigies we saw were of Hathor, but I remember, seeing the violence done to the hieroglyphs on the walls and things like that, and thinking like, yeah, obviously there's a magical potency here. It has less to do with wanting to personally, I got that intuition that it had much less to do with wanting to deface the temple and wanting to sort of desacralize it by these little tiny batteries of power, these holy symbols. They wanted to sort of you know break them. And I remember going to a place like Luxor Temple, which was much more of a public place. And things are kind of they're in in bad shape there. Obviously, they're ruins, but I remember seeing some of the obelisks and they were just still glowing so powerfully. So powerfully. You could see the radiating aura, especially against the clear sky, right? Because
Uh-huh.
there's no obstructions behind it. And I was just like, my goodness, so it kind of, and I wanted to ask you this question. It kind of points to the idea of, the ancient Egyptian god Heka. But the idea that the word Ka is in there, and some people have translated it as magic, right? The magic is using the Ka. So I was wondering your thoughts on that. How much energetics is involved in, let's say, the ritual or consecrations that you do, and what you think the Egyptians were doing.
Yeah, I think there's this wonderful book that I read by Lyle Watson called The Secret Life of Inanimate Objects. And that has a lot to do with my understanding about exactly what you're talking about with those stones in Egypt, with the hieroglyphs on any wall, the mental, uh, spiritual, psycho-spiritual, as Jean would call it, uh, impressions that you implant into whatever work you're doing, whatever thoughts you have about a particular thing. Those hieroglyphs are imbued with thousands of scribes and priests, those thousands of years walking through and reading it. And you can go to a even a Christian church, and if you kind of soft gaze your focus, I can remember watching this man who deliver an inspired sermon. It was on Christianity, but he had this incredible huge purple aura all around him, and I thought, good Lord, this guy, yeah, he was really giving it everything he had. And I thought, that's how it works.
Right.
That's how, um, they talk about in this book by Lyle Watson, he talks about a church where the statue of the Virgin Mary, cries blood tears. And it is a place that is pretty much visited by mostly Hispanic peoples who have folks on the other side they're separated from, they've lost their children, they've lost their husbands, and they're petitioning to Mary, please take care of my children. And this particular statue, so they say, will walk toward the front of the church where there's a Christ image, hanging on the wall, and she cries these tears for her son. So the priests at the time thought that somebody was trying to get in there and do some kind of weird hoodoo. So they locked the church doors and they opened them up, and there she is in the morning, you know.
Wow.
And so they thought, okay, somehow they're getting in. So we're going to chain her foot to the floor so she can't move. And they opened the door up in the morning, and there she is, chain broken in front
Wow.
of the altar. Yeah. And so everything that just shows that everything in the universe is alive and conscious and thinking. Everything. Um, the atoms that are inside that chain that broke, you know, the molecular construction of the temple walls and they were made of particular stones to accent the power of that particular temple.
Mhm.
So when you're looking at like a black granite, you've got tons of fire energy coming up. You've got all of that spirit energy. So statues of Sekhmet, oh yeah, Sekhmet, she'll move inside her temple. I can remember one time I went with Nikki Scully and a woman named Indigo Ronlove, who now leads trips of her own. And Indigo was on the verge of becoming a priestess, I'll say, of Sekhmet. And so when she had her private time to go in to see the statue at Karnak, outside Karnak, at her little chapel, It was under construction, and there was this iron gate in front of the door to Sekhmet's room. The iron gate was open. Nikki and I were standing on either side of that uh, room, either side of the iron gate, and it just shuts, it slams with indigo inside it. And she comes back, and I can remember seeing her eyes grabbing the bars, going, like what just happened? We couldn't open it. We didn't know how to open it.
Yeah.
So Nikki and I said, go back, go talk to Sekhmet. She wants to talk to you. So she did. And when Sekhmet was through talking with her, the gate just opened
Mhm.
all by itself. And Nikki and I are like, okay.
Yeah,
It was,
that's a really interesting part of all of this. And I think that for half the people, or maybe less, maybe more, but just my estimation, for a lot of the people that come to this stuff, especially through, I want to say more like, I mean, honestly, I guess masculine channels, like things like Freemasonry and stuff like that, and very, very, very sort of um tight erudition, academic kind of level, it
right.
mystifies them the way that that a statue or that a god or goddess could talk to them. And one of the things that I wanted to ask you is, how do you describe or characterize your interactions with Egyptian deities, in your personal practice? Does it come through in images? Does it come through in an actual manifestation to visible appearance?
I would say it will come through in images, but many times it's like dreaming. It's like when I'm writing, it's almost as if I'm dreaming on a piece of paper, you know. And I do have a lot of dreams in which the deities come and we do work together. So it's like interpreting a dream in
Mm,
a way. I can't explain it other than that. I will see things, intuit things, feel them. I'm more like clairsentient
mhm,
than I am clairvoyant, but I do see auras and I
mm,
do see movement of spirit out of the corners of my eye. I see orbs,
mm.
things like that. Um, but sometimes it's just like those aha moments that you get, which is clairsentient.
Right.
It's like I'm looking at a hieroglyph and it's like, oh my God, I understand this now. You know, and like I said, I would be working, trying to translate these glyphs and with all these books and pieces of paper and notes and stuff all around. And I would fall asleep on top of them, taking a nap. And when I woke up, I would know what it was, you
Yeah.
know.
And that's really interesting too, because one of in ancient temples with ancient statuary and things of that nature and religious art for them, uh, sometimes devotees and particularly, we hear about it in the Asclepian temples, the ones for healing,
Right,
supposed to go in and go to sleep and then receive a message from the God on how you are to be healed of your particular ailments. It's fascinating.
right. And there are lots of stories of sleeping in the temples and being well, sometimes impregnated by the god with, a child. But I think that's when you're impregnated with the idea, the meaning of something, you're impregnated with your next mission,
Mhm.
and I think it comes to us when we are less skeptical, consciously skeptical, and more consciously, super consciously aware that there is something out there other than us that we need to pay attention to.
Mhm. Yeah, that's a good way to put it. And so what I enjoy about what you do too is there's a bunch of historical reconstruction and as you've mentioned, lots of translation. So a lot of erudition and a lot of academic work. I'm wondering what your thoughts are in terms of preference. Do you uh, what are your thoughts on the Hermetica, the Hermetic literature that was primarily influenced really by the Hellenistic sort of infused? Do you work with that stuff, or is it mostly funerary texts, older things?
I I look at that stuff, um, but my primary focus has been on the funerary texts, mostly because I see those as being the primary alchemical consciousness of Egypt. How to turn something dead into something living, how to turn it's all kephara, it's all dung beetle stuff for me,
Mm.
uh, turn lead into gold, uh, turn fear into love, that kind of thing. That's, so that transformation of the heart, the weighing of the heart, that really is where my most powerful work has been. Not that I diss any of the medical field, I don't. The Egyptians knew an incredible amount about that. I love going into Ed Fu and looking on the walls. There's this pharmacological wall in Ed Fu that
Mm.
has all of these plants with all the plant medicines on it. We haven't quite translated it totally to know what it is, but to know that it's there
Yeah.
thrills me. And I go to a man named Gamal, who is gosh, he's just like an Egyptian shaman. He's quite amazing. He's like a sheikh, you know.
Mhm.
So I go to his oil shop every time I'm there, and he will do an entire dissertation on what these oils that he knows of were used for and how to use them. And that guy's got something going on. He'll look you up and down and read you and know exactly what you're not saying,
Mm.
know exactly what's behind your eyes, behind your smile. And he'll say, "This is what you need. You need this oil
Right.
here, to help you stand up and speak the truth to, whichever individual you have to work with."
Mhm.
So, yeah, he was good. I like him. I like
Yeah,
him a lot.
I got some Egyptian musk while I was there, man. It's my favorite thing. I wear it very selectively, but it's usually when I need to calm down. I'll just rub a little in the beard and just like kind of relax for a little.
Wow, that's great. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a wonderful smell and it reminds me of my trip. It reminds me of being there. But I you brought up alchemy. And so, it's just more and more excellent work is being done, even academically. Like in Dr. Shannon Grimes' book, she was on the podcast too. We talked about Becoming Gold, the book she wrote about Zosimus of Panopolis, and him really talking about, oh, yeah, well, Egyptian, he was an Egyptian scribe priest, and he was in charge of metallurgists that were dyeing the metals for religious statuary. So he has an understanding of alchemy as it applies not just to metals, but also to the physical body, the spirit, the soul, all those things. And I like to ask this question of people that are steeped in the Egyptian materials. Do you think that the ancient Egyptians were looking for physical truth and discovering spiritual ones? Or do you think that I'm being reductive?
Well, that's a good question. Um, but that really is about any consciousness. Like when you're a child, you're looking for some physical truth,
Hmm.
but the spirit world is always behind you, pushing you. And so you know, I think that they found what they were looking for. It may not it may not have been what they started out looking for, but I would certainly say they found what they were looking for. And I believe that the alchemy that they created around that, I look at Imhotep and I think he was there, Michelangelo, he
Mm.
was there, Leonardo da Vinci. He figured it all out and made art and made beautiful structures, building pyramids and being a doctor. He did it all. He knew he would be the epitome of somebody who figured out the physical and the spiritual and the mental, all how they all worked together.
Mhm.
He's my idol.
That's great. Yeah, and anybody that listens to some of the stuff that I do, I can come across as uh leaning a little hard into the Greek stuff. And I think that one of the most interesting things that I've discovered in my research is that this tradition of philosophy comes through in Greeks, but it only happens after they have the individual teachers, Solon, Thales, Plato, Pythagoras. The philosophy only comes to them and to their group after they go to Egypt.
That's right.
You
Right.
know, so it's like I can't read hieroglyphics, but I can read all the translations of Plato and things like that. And I think to a degree, the Greeks were developing a style of communication that was different from the Egyptians, that is more like our modern hyper rational sort of left-brained type of thinking.
Right.
Because as you say, when you were translating the hieroglyphics, you ended up with tons of stuff, wordplay. Like we don't speak or think like that anymore.
Right. Oh, it just fascinated me that the Egyptians could write something on one side of the wall that was a mirror image on the other side of the wall, and that the only way to read it was to figure out which way the heads were facing. I mean, that was kind of fascinating. And then it doubly fascinated me when I realized inside the Pyramid of Unas that the texts on the left wall were talking to the texts on the right wall. It was like it was a conversation. I could read it over here and then read the answer over there.
Wow, that's
It,
awesome.
it
That's
was
so
kind of
cool.
cool. Yeah. And you can do that. You can go to Egypt online and they have like the whole Piankov's pyramid text of Egypt,
Mm,
and you can read the various walls. And so you can start playing with, you can see this wall situated here. This is the line that's coming down. This wall over here on this side, these are the lines that are coming down. And you can read them back and forth and play with them.
mm.
Anybody could do it. Now, another person that I have read that translates and thinks Egyptology the way I do is a woman named Susan Brend Morrow. I don't know if you've had her on your show or not, but
You have
she wrote a book called it's like the dawning of the mind, and it's a book about Thoth. Let me think. See, let me see if I can if I can look it up here. Uh,
Susan Brand.
Susan Brind, Brind, Morrow. Yeah.
Ah, I
Uh,
see.
the names of things is her first one, and the dawning moon of the mind, unlocking the pyramid text.
It's a great
Yeah.
title. That's a great title.
Yeah. So she's good. She's a poet. So she thinks like a poet.
Mm.
Um, and I hate to say I'm a poet. Maybe I am. I studied poetry. I was married to a poet while I was translating these, and he's the one who gave me Ezra Pound's dictum about how to write poetry. It has to work with image, has to
Mm.
work with sound, and it has to work with narrative. So
Mm.
he called it melopia, logopia, and phenopia. And that was what I took as my directions for how to translate the text. I would go through and I would look at all of the imagery and try to put it back inside the text. Because if you do it word for word, it cuts out all the imagery inside the language. And
That's
then I would go back and put the wordplay back in, um, the sounds, the alliteration, the assonance, working as a poet and putting all that back into it. And then I would go looking for the myths that were not in one place, but I would move them over so that the myth could be understood inside the text I was reading. So it was, yeah, that's why it took me 10 years.
well worth the effort. That's really fascinating, to see that you've kind of brought that method of interpretation, bringing that kind of mind to it. And truly, I do believe a lot of spirituality depends, or at least our ability to talk about it and communicate these things, right? I
Yeah.
tend to think that, when you use strictly the discursive mind and you're trying to find words for things, it's like chopping up Osiris and putting him into little tiny boxes, and these boxes
Right.
words, and it becomes difficult, and you need that poetry to really reassemble the meaning of it. And so that really sometimes people will ask me, how do I understand this stuff? Just go read poetry or go watch like a surreal film, or something like
Right. 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 I
that.
love that idea of chopping Osiris up and putting him in these little, yeah, inside these little words. Yeah. And then trying to put it back together again. That's what it felt like. I love that description. I will use it again myself if you don't mind.
Please, please. Please. I know that you work with angelic spirituality as well. And I think particularly for people that regularly listen to my podcast, there's an intersection, right, with hermeticism, Kabbalah. There's kind of a question, or at least a perspective that reduces archangelic beings into just different, I guess, visible images of these same kind of potencies that the Egyptian gods, or let's say the Greek gods. There's this kind of, in Kabbalah, there's this filing cabinet system where each one goes and it's got a slightly different covering. And I'd be really interested to hear who somebody like, what somebody like you has to say about that. What's been your experience? Are they the same thing with different images, the completely different entities?
Um, I think the thing that fascinated me about angels and why I did my dissertation when I was getting my PhD in comparative religions, my dissertation was on angels. And that's because they wouldn't let me do anything with the Egyptian. They said, "You've already done all that. You have to pick something different." So I said, "Okay, I like angels. I'll pick these angels." And so I just started studying about angels. And I love the fact Gustav Davidson has this huge encyclopedia of all the angelic names. And I think it's probably more names than I've ever seen in any one spot.
Mhm.
And the thing that I liked about it is that he just allowed the angel to be whatever the angel was in that particular culture. You know, the peacock angel is an angel that has totally fascinated me in the Yazidi tradition. I think there's a peacock angel in the Buddhist traditions. There's a peacock deva, and I think devas are close to angels, flying beings that float up into heaven and so on.
Right.
And the multiplicity of all of their ways in which they perform their spiritual tasks.
Mhm.
Um, I think that I read the work of Eliezer ben Judah of Worms, who was the person who invented angelology. So he was a Kabbalistic rabbi during, I guess, during the Inquisition. And so the Christian soldiers came and found him, and they realized he was quite wealthy because his wife had been selling all of these manuscripts and stuff that he was putting together. And so they murdered her, stole his money, raped his daughter, killed his child, and God bless him, he just kept working on his texts. It's like, well, the angels were with him, yes, but he didn't blame them for not defending him or anything. I mean, what we think of as the powers of the gods or the goddesses are at are at a disadvantage when we have people who come in and use their minds to create chaos and
Mhm.
wreak havoc. You know, the angels, as I understand them, are a form of consciousness. They were invented at the beginning of time through the thought process of God and, spoken out like Ptah across the waters, and those vibrations of thought are what created the world, are what created us. And when we look at us, we're like 99% water, and the rest of it's a few atoms moving around. The only thing that makes us unique is our individual thoughts, you know.
Yeah.
Now, I think given that thought creates form, that's why we have meditation groups that move together and move consciousness into a focus, a laser focus, so it's moving in one direction. I love to do full moon meditations for that reason, because I love to access the divine and, you know, see what's going on. I'll take the energy too of astrology and put that into the meditations and use that. So, by the way, I'm an astrologer, and these are really interesting times we're living in right now.
Yeah. Yeah, I'd like to sometimes prod the astrologers that I have on, like, have you done any
Yeah,
readings for Earth? You know, what is that? Is that scary? What is that? Are we getting out of this mess anytime soon or
yeah, yeah. Well, there's only one way out of it, really.
True.
But
Yeah. So I guess all specifics of time, place, culture aside, how do you define spirituality? And I know that's a big question, but really what I'm asking is what is the essential quality of spiritual work for you? And how can that cross systems or cross religions or cross practices?
well, I think uh, if you understand natural law, that will be that not only thoughts are things, but everything that is also its opposite. That the only constant thing in the universe is the change, the idea of change. Um, so, it's like learning with spirit, learning how to, I'll say, regulate the thermometer of conflicting thought. All right. So, here are people on this side who are very uh, hateful acting, but they're not really, it's not hate they're acting out of, it's fear. They're acting out of fear that becomes demonstrated as hate. And then there are people who want to turn up the love. Okay, but you can't turn up the love when the heat is too much in the fear. And so what you learn to do is to try to modulate your own feelings as they come up through the day, you know, to experience more joy, more love, so that you have more joy, more love to send out as part of your spiritual, um, I guess, medicine, your spiritual medicine. And when you are afraid, to turn that down, not try to negate it, but to turn it down. You can't stop feeling what you're feeling, but you can change the quality of what you're feeling. And so I think that that is where learning how to use the natural law, which helps you to move the needle toward the other way. And that's kind of what the Zoroastrians did. They didn't have God or goddess, we thought of them. They had good thought and bad thought.
Mm.
You know, Ahura Mazda was good thought, Angramana was bad thought. And all of the devils or jinn in that particular tradition were negative thoughts, envy, jealousy, malice, etc. You know, and so you temper them by working with the angelic forces on the opposite side that move you more toward the middle of understanding. So you can look at life and say, that happens, um, crazy man got a gun and shot somebody. How do you change that? You can't change the fact of what happened, but you can send thoughts of Now, I'm not going to do peace and love kind of thing toward that person.
Mhm.
I will probably send a prayer that they come to an understanding of what happened and why they did what they did.
Mm.
And if they can come to that, that can change them and eventually change the outcome of how people understand it. Now,
Mm.
one of the other things that is interesting is the concept of going back to Heka of naming something. You know, the ancient Egyptians would say my name that I may live."
Mm.
You know, you say a thought out loud and it becomes a reality. So you don't just jokingly say something because you've said it out loud and it's already starting to become a reality.
Mm.
So you have to be very conscious and aware of choosing how you want to express something. I think I'm wandering from the question, but
Oh, go all good points. This is great. It feels almost inspired, you know?
yeah, I think that that's probably the best that I can say is that you watch your speech,
Mm.
watch your thought processes. If you're mindful, and I really mean mindful, because that's where everything starts. If you're mindful of what you're thinking and doing, then all the better, and things will come out as they should. And whenever I say a prayer, you know, whenever I say an affirmation, I always add at the end of it this or something better,
Mm.
so that if I wanted so and so to become president, then I would say this or something better. you know
Yeah.
and at this point, adding those lines to any prayer for any candidate would be a good idea.
So it's just a delight to chat with you, really. Honestly, fantastic stuff. And what's pretty cool is that you've got a Patreon where people can have sort of, I think you called it coffee chats or something like that with you.
Coffee chats,
Yeah,
yeah, we can
that's
have
awesome.
coffee chats.
Well, tell us about that.
Okay, so it's wordsofpower.com. The Patreon's called wordsofpower.com. You can reach it from my website, normandyellis.com. And yeah, I try to post once or twice a month. And at $5 rate, it's just the basic stuff. At the $10 rate, we'll have those chats, and we'll do some other things. I am hoping to take the Book of the Dead and read it myself. A lot of people uh, use the Book of the Dead when they're traveling through Egypt, or they'll use it with their spiritual groups as they are teaching them. In the state, I've met a lot of people that say, "Oh, I use your book at my groups all the time. I read from it all the time." And I think to myself, why am I not reading from it all the time? So I'm intending to do that. Jean's version of having read the Book of the Dead was beautiful, powerful, and it is out of print. And so I'm hoping to start getting my stuff out there through my own voice, because it's the power of one's own voice.
Yes.
And I have to say, I had some throat surgery that left me vocally impaired
Mm.
for months. And I realized I couldn't teach, I couldn't, and so I decided if this comes back, that's what I'm going to do with this voice. So,
There you go. There you go. Very good. So everybody gets a canned question at the end of the episode where I put them on the spot. We've talked
okay.
about a lot of things. We talked about Egypt, we talked about angels, we've talked about all sorts. Um, for anybody that's listening to this podcast, could you boil it down to maybe three introductory books or important books that you would recommend to them if they want to maybe dig a little deeper into some of the topics we've covered today?
Okay. Well, I did mention Lyle Watson's book. And so I would recommend that. I would recommend Susan Brenda Morrow's The Names of Things. Um, Aside from those two, um, Pionkov's. Pyramid of Unas. His translation of the Pyramid of Unas. I always wanted to translate that after I did the Book of the Dead. I got halfway through and didn't finish. It's amazing the amount of information that is contained inside that particular translation. And those glyphs are not pictures. They are hieroglyphs. They're actual hieroglyphs as they appeared on the wall, up and down, up and down, up and down. So I would read Pionkov's pyramid text of Unas. I would read, Eric Horning's Conceptions of God in Ancient Egypt. I think that's a very powerful book. Um, there are so many that have come across lately. I want to lift up Naomi Ozaniak.
Mhm.
She has done some amazing work on priestessing, and our most recent one was called Becoming the Garment of Isis.
Mm.
And it is really about how to devote yourself to the goddess. And I really want to recommend that book.
Great. Awesome. Well, thank you so much for taking a little time out of your day to speak with me. It's really an honor and a pleasure, and I'm looking forward to everything that you've got coming up for everyone. Thank you so much for being here.
Oh, thank you, Ike. Glad to be here.